Thanks everybody for being here. I decided to talk today about emotion regulation and why, because emotions is something that is always there, always in the background, and I think it's one of those things that is so common that we oftentimes don't think very much about it. They are attached to everything that we do and most of the things that we think. And for the purpose of psychiatric or mental health practice, talking about emotions is going to be very useful in my view, because overly reactive or overly intense emotional experiences, as I'm sure you know, are very common chief complaints or very important coexisting complaints when we engage in psychiatric or mental health practice. And people that experience intense or rapidly shifting or feel as if they have little control over their emotions they suffer quite a bit. They can be very distressing, and they can lead to erratic or impulsive or the kinds of behaviors that people will oftentimes regret, and behaviors that are largely driven by overreactive or overly intense emotions oftentimes will have consequences which can then create more emotional difficulties down the road. So it can create a cascade. And it's also that comes frequently to our attention because medications, by and large, don't work all that well. You can certainly find some people with emotional reactivity issues that will benefit from some kinds of medicines, but it's difficult to have them generalize across a large population. And for many folks who try them, they have little benefit and sometimes lots of side effects. So thinking about emotions and talking about them, I hope to leave you with some insights that will help you to better understand the nature of the struggles and some tools for how to counsel people that have such difficulties. And I'm going to try to still complete all this in as close to 15 minutes as I can. And we're going to talk about what I call the what and why of emotions. I'm going to do because this is going to be a short talk, I'm going to do a very high level or very simplistic summary of the neurobiology emotion, and then I'm going to discuss how one can regulate emotions. So let's start with, what are emotions? Emotions, I like to think of them as the name that we give to the feeling of your body. Certain emotions involve responses typically to situations, events, or to thoughts or to memories. They are attached to changes of blood pressure, pulse, the amount of sweat that we produce, to a sensation of energy or lack of energy, or to alarm. And all these things that I described are neurobiological or neurophysiological processes. They have a certain kind of feeling, and we call them emotion. And they involve directing your attention to a thought, event, or a memory. Um, they involve creating and assigning a valence or assigning an emotional meaning to something. And once you have noticed something and given it a valenced meaning, then you will have certain kinds of thoughts or feelings that contribute to the subjective experience of emotion. So it's a lot of words. That's why I like to say it's the way that physiology feels. And this is a point, this is a bit of a tangent, but this is extremely important from Shep's paper. One thing the emotions are not are ballistic entities that must proceed to completion. Once I feel angry, I don't have to take anger to some sort of endpoint. Emotions are not, they're not, I love this word, ballistic. And because they chose the word ballistic, then you have this quote here from Messamore, um, that a suggestion, let's not ever use the word trigger in the setting of mental health practice. Trigger words are extremely important, and even small metaphors have outsized impacts on the way that we think of people or people think about themselves. So triggers are things that belong to guns. Triggers are things that are passively activated and always result in explosions. Human beings are not that way, and emotions are not that way. I think I think the idea of of telling somebody that they have a trigger started off as a way to try to be nice, or to be gentle, and to acknowledge that it feels to the person that they don't have a lot of control over how their body or their emotion reacts. But when you say you were triggered or what is your trigger, you are giving this person and yourself an unhelpful metaphor that suggests that they have no control over what the trigger is and what the response is going to be. So that's extremely disempowering, and is actually an unnecessary and unhelpful metaphor. So they're not ballistic entities. Why do we have them? Essentially because for most things that human beings have, they're associated with improving our survival. Um, Emotions serve many functions. They we human beings do not survive as solitary entities. We are hardwired to be social animals. We only survive in groups. And so because we're in groups, we have nature has endowed us with the need to have hierarchies and to to signal to each other what's going on. So emotions, many of them are attached to facial expressions or body language or changes of language intonation, which have a clear signal to other members in the group that something is going on with me if I'm demonstrating these outward signs of emotion. We also have emotions as part of our human/primate social hierarchy mechanisms. So we have a capacity to feel shame, and shame puts us in our place. So there's a we could talk for many minutes about the way that emotions can play in a social hierarchy, but one of the arguments why we have them and why sometimes they're unpleasant is because they serve that function. And like physical pain, emotional pain can be a signal to us that we need to modulate our behaviors in some way. So all these things together um, eventually contribute to greater success in human groups and greater survival of human groups and species. Let's talk about, so we've talked about the how and the why and the what. Let's talk about, let's talk about the how, the neurobiology of emotion. Again, this is a short talk. This is going to be a simplified um, condensation of some neurobiology, but essentially emotions consist of thoughts, feelings, and what I call doing. And doing in this case, I'm referring to mostly the downstream physiological effects, like the feeling of heaviness, the secretion of stress hormones like cortisol, or the quickening of pulse or the slowing down of things. But doing can also involve behavioral repertoires like screams or running away or making advances or something like that. And emotions are broken down into situations that occur, attention to situations, the appraisal or the assignment of emotional valence, and the response, either the physiological or the behavioral response. And responses can change situations. So that creates a kind of a loop. Here are the neuroanatomical structures. What I Mesomore term thinking brain consists of dorsal structures and rostral structures. So largely prefrontal cortex and areas within this, as well as portions of the cingulate cortex. We have what Mesomore calls the emoting brain. So these are the parts of the brain that are involved in the generation of or the assignment of valence. Like the amygdala, for example, gets input from all the senses and from the frontal cortex, which is presenting the amygdala with some analysis of the situation. Amygdala then turns on or not feelings of anxiety or anger. So the assignment of valence happens in the bottom. And these structures are also part of, I think many people will have heard, the limbic system. So this is the emotion brain. And the emotion sections are attached to the thinking parts and to the association areas. They're also attached to things like hypothalamus and the brainstem regions that will send the physiological response downstream. So, and again, physiological response will change attention and maybe the situation. So these are the areas. Key point is that these parts, the emotional brain, are connected to these parts, the thinking brain. And because of those connections, we have opportunities for intervening. So let's talk about how we can regulate emotion. You'll recognize this graph or this figure. I showed this to you 2 slides ago. And there are multiple stages as well as multiple neuroanatomical regions that are involved in this process. So at every stage, we have potential to modify. We can, if we're in a situation, we can change, we can remove ourselves from a situation, or we can modify our environment. We can pay attention to what we're paying attention to, and we can try to pay attention to other things. We can notice the interpretations that we're having. Oh no, here it goes again, I'm bound to fail. Or we could change that cognition script to, I'm in a situation that I don't like. I may or may not succeed, and if I don't succeed, I'm going to learn something, and so forth. I mean, there are many adaptations for how you can reframe a situation, and we can choose how to respond. We can say, I have an emotion of anger. I feel like I want to yell at this person, but now that I've noticed this is happening, I think I'm going to say something nice instead, or say nothing at all instead. So we can intervene in all these steps, and practicing awareness of them. Excuse me. The most commonly used emotion regulation therapy is called dialectical behavior therapy. There are many others that ultimately target emotion regulation, and they have these elements in common across all of them. We teach clients about how emotions work, letting them know along the way that there are many stages at which they could intervene. They all involve, in one way or the other, whether they outright call it mindfulness or they use some other language, they involve developing a capacity to notice what's happening, notice when I'm feeling aroused, notice when I'm having certain kinds of ideas, notice when I'm in situations where bad things might happen. And then they involve learning about alternate strategies and rehearsing them. And the more you practice, the more you develop the ability to notice what's going on, and the more you practice strategies to change your responses to what's going on, the more likely you are to succeed. Not only succeed, but as I'm going to show you now, you're likely to literally reshape how your brain functions. So I'm going to show you some slides that basically show the effect of emotion regulating psychotherapies on brain structure and function. Here we're looking at measures of intra-brain connectivity. So yellow regions represent higher intraneuronal connections. And you'll see here that they're involved in cingulate cortex, insular cortex, prefrontal cortex. Again, many of the areas which I showed you in my high-level overview are known to be involved in the regulation, in the generation or the modification of emotion. Another technique, going now to the dialectical behavior therapy, we're looking here at gray matter volume in the rostral anterior cingulate cortex and the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex. Again, real estate which is involved in the regulation and generation of emotion. And we'll see that in the dark gray areas, individuals who are rehearsing from the DBT manual about mindfulness and distress tolerance and emotion regulation skills, they're building gray matter density in a key brain region. They don't really have any really cool brain images in this picture, in this paper, but the title says a lot. DBT alters emotion regulation and amygdala activity. Recall, the amygdala is part of the limbic circuit, which is largely devoted to telling the brain, yes, this is something to be fearful of. Yes, this is something to be angry about. And data show that people with borderline personality, the quintessential emotion regulation difficulty, have basically overactive amygdalas. and overreactive amygdalas. And 12 months of straight up textbook DBT and practice was able to substantially reduce amygdala activation and amygdala reactivity. So the more you do it, the better you get. So to summarize, emotions consist of multiple facets and multiple stages. Most of these facets and stages are entirely modifiable. We can learn about what stage we're in, and we can do things about it. Human beings have an incredible capacity to learn and change. One thing that people do across the globe all the time is to learn foreign languages. They also learn how to play trumpets and pianos and to do ballet. So, and we learn all these things by simply following a program and repeating them and rehearsing them and practicing them. And as we practice a language, we rewire our brain, we change connections, we change how the brain works in ways that make that task much easier down the road. Emotion regulation is no different in essence than learning Spanish. It involves learning how to learn, doing exercises and practicing them. And just like learning a language, if we practice, if we learn how emotions work and we practice emotion regulation strategies, the data that I've just showed you shows that we can help clients to better regulate their emotions, and in the process are changing how their brain works in ways that make that task more easy. So those are the ends of my slides. We'll send this out as a PDF. Some of these are open access papers if you want to read more. These are all worth the effort.